Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 6 of the fantasy football season. You guys should know the drill by now of how I do these videos, but just in case I have any first time listeners, what you're getting out of me is my top 2 starts at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and the tight end position, as well as the top 2 sits at each of those positions. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and dive into today's video. Starting with the quarterback position, as I always do. My top quarterback start of the week, I am going to go with Kirk Cousins against the Bears. I know he lost Justin Jefferson for the foreseeable future, but I still see Kirk Cousins having success. We've seen the emergence of rookie Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne still in the offense. They got TJ Hawkinson, Josh Oliver, Brandon Powell. They have enough weapons for Kirk to spread the ball around in this game. And then you just got to look at the matchup. They're going against that Chicago Bears defense, who's allowing the most points per game to the quarterback position thus far in this season, giving up 22.4 points a game to quarterbacks. And then what you look at what the Bears have allowed over the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different 300 plus yard passers, and Patrick Mahomes would have actually gotten over 300 yards, but he was pulled early because they're kicking the Bears' butt. But if you do combine the numbers between him and Gabbert, they both combined for over 300 passing yards. So technically, they have allowed 4 straight 300 passing yards games over the last 4 games, and then over that period, they have allowed 9 passing touchdowns, and they've only picked off the quarterback once. So I think this is a great play. This is a peak Kirk spot. We know how Kirk is. In fantasy, he's a matchup-based dependent quarterback, and when the matchup's right, that's when Kirk typically has his ceiling games. So this is a week I would definitely get him in my lineup. My other top start, I am going to go with Matthew Stafford against the Cardinals defense. The Cardinals, they have allowed the 4th most points per game to quarterbacks this year, giving up 21 points a game. Now, as far as Stafford, since he's been with the Los Angeles Rams, he's averaged 272 yards a game against Arizona, and in the 3 games that he's played the Cardinals as a Ram, he has 5 touchdowns and 1 interception. And then when you look at what the Cardinals have allowed over the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different 280 plus yard passing games, and then they have allowed 7 passing touchdowns, but they do have 3 interceptions over the last 4 games. But interceptions really don't count that much in fantasy football. So yeah, I think Matthew Stafford is a great play for week 6. My sits, I've been talking him up throughout since week 2, but this might be a week you want to consider other options than C.J. Stroud. He's going against the Saints defense. The Saints have only given up 12.5 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the 6th fewest across the league. And then when you look at the last 4 games, 2 quarterbacks didn't even cross 200 yards passing, and then they've only given up 5 passing touchdowns and have 4 interceptions over the last 4 games. So averaging little over one touchdown a game allowed. So I see this being more of a floor game for C.J. Stroud than his ceiling. My other top sit, let's see if he can prove me wrong once again, but the matchup is saying to void Jared Goff this week against the Buccaneers defense. The Buccaneers are only giving up 13.6 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the 8th fewest across the NFL. Now the Bucs are coming off a bye week too, and their defense, their secondary was pretty banged up entering that bye week, so they should hopefully get some pieces back in that defense and fortify things in the back end. But when you look at what they have allowed in the first 4 games, they only allowed 4 passing touchdowns, and they picked off the quarterback 6 times. So only giving up averaging 1 passing touchdown a game. So I can just see this also being a potential low ceiling game for Jared Goff and him not hitting. A low floor game for Jared Goff and him not getting close to that ceiling that he can get at points when the matchups are right throughout the season. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits at the quarterback position. So let's just go ahead and move into running backs. My top start of the week, he's going to be playing tomorrow night, and so if you do have him, make sure he is in your lineup. But I am going to go with Isaiah Pacheco against that Denver Broncos defense. Statistically, one of the worst defenses to start a season in NFL history. But when you look at what they've allowed in fantasy, they're allowing 36.8 3 points per game to running backs this year. That's the most allowed. Plenty of points to go around to that running back group in KC, but I expect Isaiah Pacheco to dominate the touches. And then when we look at the last 4 games for that Denver defense, they have allowed 3 different 100-yard rushers, and then they have allowed 8 running back rushing touchdowns, and they have allowed 4 receiving running back touchdowns. So they have allowed 12 touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 games. So yeah, if you got Isaiah Pacheco, this is definitely the week to fire him up. We just saw what Breece Hall did to them last week, and I think Pacheco's going to run all over them tomorrow night. My other top start, I'm going to go with Raheem Mostert against the Panthers. Now, we all heard the unfortunate news. Devin Achane is on the IR now. So this is going to be Mostert's backfield. But I will say this. Jeff Wilson did practice today. Jeff Wilson is technically still on the IR. They have 21 days to activate him off the IR. So Jeff Wilson might be playing in this game. So he could actually be a very sneaky play in like daily lineups. He probably will be a cheaper option than Mostert. But yeah, either way, they both draw a great matchup. They're going against that Panthers defense who's allowing 26.5 points per game to running backs this year. That is the second highest amount. Over the last 4 games, they've only allowed 1 running back to run over 100 yards, but there was 2 running backs that finished with over 90 yards over the last 4 games against the Panthers defense. And then when we look at the touchdowns, they've given up 6 rushing touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 games, 0 receiving touchdowns, but still, that they're giving up 6 touchdowns, they're giving up a lot of yards, and they just let David Montgomery run all over them. So I see Mostert having success, and like I said, if Jeff Wilson does get activated off the IR this week, he could be a sneaky play. Like as far as seasonal leagues, probably like a sneaky flex play, but I think he could be a cheap option for you in those daily lineups. My top sits. Now it's like you're probably looking at me like, Cody, am I really going to sit Breece Hall after he just went off? I understand you might play him. I'm one of the leagues I have him in. I'm considering because of my options at running back. So I will say with Breece Hall, for any first-time listeners, there's a term, and I'm going to get to this in the wide receiver spot in the wide receiver segment. It's probably going to upset some people with some names I have on there. If you play Breece Hall, I get it. Just temper your expectations. He's probably going to have a closer to his floor matchup than to his ceiling. If he ends up getting to his ceiling, that's just even better. But when you put those daily lineups, that's a name I would look to avoid this week. Now, looking at this matchup against the Eagles defense, Eagles have only allowed 7.6 points per game to running backs this season. And then you got to factor in the New York Jets just lost Elijah Vera Tucker, who's one of their best, if not best, offensive linemen. He's done for the season for their with a torn Achilles, so that's going to hurt Breece Hall's rushing lanes opening up for him. And then when you look at the last 4 games, the highest amount of yards by a single running back against the Eagles defense was 53 yards. And then over the last 4 games, they've only allowed 1 running back rushing touchdown, 0 running back receiving touchdown. So just 1 touchdown allowed to running backs over the last 4 games. So this matchup says you probably should sit him. I get it why you would want to play him, especially how he looked this past Sunday. But I would just definitely temper your expectations if you put him in your lineups this week. My other sit, this would be a name I would look to avoid this week, is going to be Rachaad White against the Lions. The Lions defense, they are only allowing 9.2 points per game to running backs this year. That is the second fewest across the NFL. Over the last 4 games, the highest amount gained by a single running back was 43 yards. And then as far as touchdowns allowed, they've only given up 2 rushing touchdowns to running backs and 0 receiving touchdowns. So only 2 touchdowns over the last 4 games to running back position. So they got a very stout defense. That Bucs offensive line's kind of improving, but they're still kind of their ground game's a work in progress. So if you do have better options than Rachaad White this week, this is definitely a week I would look to leave him on my bench. So yeah, that's the top starts and sits at running back. So let's move into this wide receiver position, which I already know I'm going to hear some flack about some of these names in my sit position, but I'll explain my reasoning. And again, like I said, there's some temper your expectation plays. But let's start with the guys you want to definitely play this week. My top starts of the week, I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks against the Chargers. Maybe Michael Gallup could be a sneaky daily fantasy lineup play, because he'll definitely be cheaper than both those guys. But then when you look at this matchup, the Chargers so far have allowed 32.6 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the highest amount in the NFL. And then they are coming off their bye week, so they've only played 4 games this season, but in those first 4 games, they have allowed 2 different 100 plus yard receiving games to a wide receiver, and they have given up 6 receiving touchdowns to the wide receiver position. So giving up a lot of yards, giving up a lot of points, and I think I expect this Dak Prescott and this Dallas Cowboys passing attack to bounce back after seeing the 49ers last week. The 49ers easily have probably the best defense in the NFL, and they're giving everybody problems. So I think the Cowboys offense will look to get things back on track against this weak Chargers secondary and get CeeDee Lamb going and Brandon Cooks going on Monday night. My other top start of the week, I am going to go with Drake London against the Commanders. The Commanders are allowing 32.4 points per game. That is the second highest amount, and obviously it's basically Drake London. They got Matt Collins, and they just traded for Van Jefferson. But my whole point is Drake's dominating the targets in that wide receiver room. And this is a great matchup for him to have one of his ceiling performances this week. And then as far as what the Commanders have allowed over the last 4 games, they have allowed 4 different 100-plus receiving games to the wide receiver position. And they have also given up 7 wide receiver receiving touchdowns over the last 4 games. So they're giving up a lot of touchdowns, a lot of just single 100-yard performances. So I would not be surprised if Drake London gets you 100-plus yards and a touchdown or 2 this Sunday. Moving into the sits. Now, I'm going to go, I already understand. Some of you guys are probably like, I'm not going to sit, Deebo Samuel or A.J. Brown. Yeah, I get it. If you're playing in seasonal leagues, these are temper your expectation plays because they are drawing a bad matchup. So let's start with my number one top sit. Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Going against the Browns defense, where if you look at the statistics, the Browns are making a strong case for having one of the best defenses in the NFL. I saw a stat today where they're causing the highest rate percentage of 3-and-outs this season. When we look at it as far as fantasy, right? So they're allowing only 10 points a game to the wide receiver position. That is the fewest amount in the NFL. Now, the Browns are coming off their bye week. So again, they're coming off the bye week, should be a lot healthier for their defense. In the first 4 games of the season, they only allowed 1 100-yard receiving game, and that was to George Pickens. The next highest amount to a single wide receiver was 56 yards. And they have yet to allow either a receiving or a rushing touchdown to a wide receiver so far this year. Now, another thing I want to factor in too, besides all those stats, is Deshaun Watson didn't practice today. You're probably wondering, how is Deshaun Watson going to affect Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel's production? Well, like I said, that 49ers defense is great. If Deshaun Watson doesn't play, I expect that 49ers defense to dominate the Browns offense. And then we saw what the 49ers did this past week, right? Beat up on the Cowboys. So if all of a sudden this San Francisco 49ers team is up 2 or 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk are going to go to the sidelines. I mean, that's what happened against the Cowboys this past Sunday. Now, you did get some production out of both of them, but that's what you're going to have to hope for. But they also not only draw that bad matchup, but there's also a game script where these guys could be on the sidelines because they're beating up on the Browns because the Browns don't have their quarterback in this game. Moving into my next sit, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith against the Jets. Again, you're going to play A.J. Brown and probably Devontae Smith and the 2 guys I just talked about. But again, I would just temper your expectations with these players because they might not be able to reach their ceilings because of the matchup that they're in. Now, looking at this matchup for Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, they're going against the Jets defense, who are only giving up 12.3 points per game. That's the second fewest amount in the NFL. Obviously, they got Sauce Gardner, who can lock up majority of wide receivers in this league in his young career. And then when we look at the last 4 games for the Jets defense, they've only allowed 1 100-yard receiving game, and that was to CeeDee Lamb. So again, maybe these guys can have that type of ceiling performance, but they have only allowed 1 100-yard receiving game over the last 4 games. The second highest amount by a single wide receiver over the last 4 games was only 50 yards. And then just like the Browns defense, they have allowed 0 wide receiver receiving and rushing touchdowns over the last 4 games. Not just like the Browns, but over the last 4 games. They have not allowed a receiving or a rushing touchdown. to a wide receiver. So the matchup says that, and maybe the Jets have enough. They have enough skill position players, right, to maybe try to keep up with the Eagles. But again, we're still kind of Zach Wilson flashed or whatever against the Chiefs, but he didn't really necessarily gave you something to believe in against a terrible Broncos defense. So just like I talked about with Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, like, couldn't you just see the Eagles all of a sudden beating up on the Jets? And if AJ Brown and Devontae Smith don't get their production before they pull the starters, then they're going to have closer to a floor game than a ceiling. So again, you're probably going to play these guys. I get it. You probably should, unless you have better options. But I would just temper your expectations. But these are names I'm definitely going to be avoiding when I put my daily lineups together this weekend. Moving into the final segment, my top starts and sits at the tight end position. And maybe there's a reason too, I forgot to mention. I'm going to go ahead and tie this in with the group I just talked about. But my top start of the week, Dallas Goedert against the Jets. Because what seems to be happening, right, in terms of fantasy, is all the fantasy points seem to be funneling to tight ends against the Jets and not to the wide receivers. When you look at this, what the Jets have allowed this year to tight ends, they're allowing 11.8 points per game to tight ends. That is the highest amount across the NFL. In the last 4 games, 2 different tight ends have gone over 50-plus receiving yards, and they have allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to tight ends over the last 4 games. So they're giving up averaging a touchdown a game to tight ends. And sometimes, I always say this guy pretty much every week, sometimes all you could ask for is just a touchdown out of your tight end and you'll be happy. It's an odds-on favorite that Goddard's probably going to find the end zone, and he should be able to get you that 50-plus yards at least. My other top start, this could be a sneaky play at the tight end position, but going with Noah Fant against the Bengals. The Bengals are giving up 10.2 points per game to tight ends this year. That is tied for the second highest amount to the tight end position. They have allowed 2 different 45-plus yard receiving games over the last 4 games, and then they have allowed 3 receiving touchdowns to tight ends over the last 4 games. So tight ends have found success. It's just 2 weeks ago we saw Noah Fant take that ball down the sidelines for a big explosive touchdown play. So we know what he can do in open space. And then we saw the Bengals offense, right, kind of getting back on track. So this might end up turning into a shootout type of matchup. And if it can turn into a shootout type of matchup, that's going to eventually potentially create some volume of opportunity for Fant to produce and get to his ceiling, and then take advantage of this matchup against a defense that has been giving up points and yardage to the tight ends this year. My top sit of the week, I'm going with Chigo Okonkwo against the Ravens. He's kind of been a letdown from the summer hype. I'll definitely say that. But you think he'd be a good play, especially with Treylon Burks, who hasn't played in a couple weeks. But if you're looking for a streaming tight end, that is a name I would definitely avoid this week. As far as his matchup, going against that Baltimore Ravens defense, who are allowing the fewest amount of points per game to tight ends this year. The most yards they have allowed to a single tight end has been 46 yards over the last 4 games. The next highest amount of yards they have allowed to a single tight end over the last 4 games is 11 yards, and they have allowed 0 touchdowns to tight ends over the last 4 games as well. So that Baltimore Ravens defense, despite all the injuries that they have dealt with, they have been playing great football through the first quarter of the season, and I don't think that's going to change on Sunday out there in London. So if you're thinking about playing Chigo this week, I think this is going to be another week that you will want to avoid him. My next top sit of the week, I'm going with Dalton Schultz against the Saints. I know Dalton Schultz finally came on this past weekend, and you might be thinking he's finally going to be that steady Eddie fantasy tight end that he has been in the past. But I would look to not play him this week. He's drawn the New Orleans Saints, where if you guys have been listening to me for a while, I always talk about how historically over the last few 3 to 5 years, that for whatever reason, the Saints have always been a great defense against tight ends in fantasy. You'd want to play your tight end against the Saints, and it looks like it's not going to change this year. They're only giving up 3.2 points per game to tight ends this year. That's the 3rd fewest across the NFL. When you look at the last 4 games, the most yards they allowed to a single tight end was 49 yards. The next highest amount was 20 yards, and they have only allowed 1 receiving touchdown to a tight end over the last 4 games. So once again, the Saints defense is very stout. Historically, they say they're really good at good against this position in fantasy, and it looks like it's continuing this year. So I wouldn't want to, bet on last week's production on Schultz into this week when he's drawing this matchup. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 6. As always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you have not followed or subscribed to me on all my social media platforms, make sure you go do that. Other than that, if you have any questions about players I did not talk about in this video, you can, as you already know, you can get in my comment sections or slide into a DM, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Other than that, I'm going to hop off here. I hope you guys win your matchups. I hope you guys enjoy your weekend of football. I'll talk to you guys next week when I do the waiver wires and streamable defenses on Tuesday. Peace out.